Hey everyone. So today I'm sharing a story that should have shaken the entire country to its core, but somehow really seemed to slip through the cracks. I don't really remember this causing the outrage I would have expected it to. I don't even know if it made national headlines. I mean, I know it made the papers and the news here in Florida, but nationally, I'm not so sure how much publicity it even received. Regardless, we're going to talk about it today here. So, this is the story of the Arthur G. Dozier School for Boys, a place that called itself a reform school but acted way more like a prison camp. And this is going to be a tough one to listen to or learn about if you haven't heard about it already. I'm just going to give that a mention quickly, but I think it's important that people do know about it. This was a place where children were beaten, they were starved, they were worked like slaves, and sometimes they were buried in unmarked graves. So, this was coined a reform school, as I mentioned, hosting both boys and girls at first. When Florida opened the state reform school in 1900, actually on New Year's Day 1900, let's talk about timing. In Marianna, Florida, a small town sitting in Jackson County, which is in northwest Florida, about an hour west of Tallahassee, it initially was supposed to rehabilitate both boys and girls who'd gotten into trouble or who simply had nowhere else to go. I mean, they could get in trouble for seemingly anything, or just for being poor or orphaned. Children as young as 5 or 6 were sent there for things like skipping school or being left on their own too often. Could you imagine your 5-year-old being taken and sent to a reform school? It's totally insane, especially a reform school like this one ended up being. So, originally, it was intended to be the national model for troubled youth, with immaculate grounds. I mean, it even held a Christmas light show that attracted visitors from around the entire state. And an early brochure showed clean cut boys playing bugles and called the school a place in the sun. But it was about as far away from that image in reality as possible. Sure, the grounds were nice, but that was definitely it. So, as early as 1903, after hearing complaints about the institution, a committee from the state legislature investigated and found that the school administrators were beating boys. They were feeding them poorly and hiring them out for labor. Children as young as 5, the committee found, had been shackled and chained in small cells. 5 more investigations followed over the next decade. One of them, in 1911, reported that the beatings had continued and likened the African American side of the then segregated campus to a convict camp. But no real change was ever actually implemented. It's fucking crazy. I don't even understand. So by 1914, all of the girls were moved to a new campus in Ocala, Florida. There had been concerns of overcrowding and just of cohabitation in general. So the Marianna School became a boys only institution, the place that would earn the name Arthur G. Dozier School for Boys and a reputation for terror. There's been numerous name changes that I don't think really matter, so I'm not going to go through them all. Anyway, that same year, the girls were relocated in 1914. There was a fire that ripped through one of the dormitories and people burned to death. Trapped inside, while staff fumbled or failed to unlock the doors, it's reported that there were at least 8 students and 2 staff members who died from the fire, and that the headmaster, who actually had the keys on him, wasn't even on campus that night. There are reports that also state that boys were chained to their beds or to the floors or were shackled and were unable to escape because of this. It's so awful and hard to process the terror that those children faced, and thinking about their last moments is so heartbreaking and sickening. I can't even. Anyway, at the very least, you'd think that this fire would have sparked some real change. But instead, the school kept operating with few safety improvements and just new management. But nothing got any better for the boys. In fact, punishment for the boys had been ruled inhumane and cruel. Somehow, even harsher punishments began, and the fire, which took the lives of those at least 10 people, was largely just swept under the rug. No one was ever held responsible for the fire or for the deaths that were almost certainly avoidable. There was just, new management. So during this time period, and because this was the Deep South under Jim Crow, white and black boys were strictly segregated. They lived in different buildings, ate in different dining halls, and were assigned different work. They weren't intended to have really any interaction at all. They weren't even supposed to speak with each other. Black boys were often sent to the hardest, most dangerous labor in the fields or forests or the swamps, while white boys were sometimes assigned to workshops or tasks that were deemed more skilled. And when it came to punishment, black boys received far more beatings and more brutal treatments. But don't misunderstand me. This school was awful for all attendees. The school claimed to operate on a merit-based system. So boys that followed the rules and worked hard and didn't attempt escape could earn early release or parole. But it didn't actually operate that way at all. And I'll get more into this in just a bit. But first I want to talk about how this was more of a labor camp than a reform school. So one of the most disturbing parts of Dozier's story is how the school needed boys to survive financially. Children were the school's workforce, their bread and butter. They were picking cotton, cutting timber, running the printing presses. They were all unpaid, exhausting jobs. Oftentimes, boys that were much too young or much too small were tasked with doing jobs that were super dangerous, resulting in terrible injuries, sometimes losing limbs, losing a foot. Sometimes they lost their lives. They'd be working in swamps or other terrible conditions in the Florida heat for up to 18 hours a day. But when the numbers of enrollees dropped, local sheriffs and judges were pressured to round up more kids for truancy, for loitering, petty theft, or charges that were often exaggerated or fabricated just to keep the school's operations profitable. For decades, this was a state-sanctioned child slavery, hidden behind the word reform. So this part is arguably one of the sickest parts of this place's history. Deep inside this immaculate campus stood a small white building known as the White House. This was where boys were taken for their punishments, some of their punishments. Whippings with leather straps so severe that oftentimes the boys would lose consciousness. Some had their clothing actually embedded into their skin. Think about that. Survivors described hearing other children's screams echoing through the night. They would also report that the stench alone of bodily fluids was overwhelming as soon as they walked in. It was a creepy building. One of them had one cell which hosted one single light bulb hanging from a concrete ceiling, concrete walls, with a metal bed frame and just dirty, dingy bedding. Students were instructed to hang onto the bed frame and not let go as they were whipped, and all of the children knew what would happen to them at the White House. They'd be taken from their beds in the middle of the night, woken with flashlights, and then forced to stand in line and wait their turn, hearing all of the painful tortures that the boys before them would undergo. Sometimes they'd be taken there for no reason at all, or not even have any idea what they'd done. There was so much psychological abuse. One kid was brought on his very first day in attendance to the school and was barely even 8 years old. And he reported the beating as being worse than anything he'd ever experienced before or since. The White House was a torture chamber where grown adults would just pick children to bring there and to beat. And these beatings were insane. It's so unbelievably sick. And the fact that no other faculty stepped in to help save these boys, I don't understand. It's beyond me. I can't imagine people didn't know about it. Other faculty didn't know about it. All of the survivors report saying that it was a well-known location on campus. Jesus. Okay. So in the 1950s, the state opened the Okeechobee School for Boys to relieve the crowding at Dozier, but it repeated just the same horrors. There were beatings, there was forced isolation, forced labor, and there was sexual abuse that happened on both campuses. The children were undergoing the same nightmares just hundreds of miles away. Proving the problem wasn't one school. It was a broken, abusive system. Rapes were widely reported years after the fact by survivors who'd attended either campus. Apparently, they would be taken in the middle of the night, just like to the White House, and just taken to dark, dingy rooms or outside by staff members and forcibly sodomized, raped, regardless of their age or who they were, if they'd ever been in trouble. Nobody was safe. The faculty at this school, oh my God, it's difficult to imagine people who could have been more sick or depraved or just totally negligent, turning the other way, pretending it wasn't happening. Okay, so in 1968, corporal punishment was banned at state-run institutions. But hair-raising reports about conditions at Dozier continued until at least, get this, 2007, when surveillance cameras caught guards choking a teenager and beating him unconscious on a concrete floor. And yet a century's worth of investigations had all just fizzled out without any consequence. I mean, remember the first investigation was in 1903? So that meant that laws meant nothing, not at Dozier, not to the people running when the people running the place refused to care. So as I briefly mentioned earlier, one of the most twisted things about Dozier was the so-called merit system that they implemented. A system which claimed boys could earn their way out through good behavior and just from hard work. In theory, if you did what you were told, worked without complaint, and kept your head down, you'd earn points towards early release or privileges like better food, less grueling chores, no trips to the White House. But in reality, the system was rigged. Staff could give or take points at will. They could decide your good behavior didn't matter at all because they needed you to keep working in the fields or chopping trees. Boys who wet the bed, talked back, or tried to escape were punished brutally. I mean, it's horrific. Many were beaten in the White House or sent to solitary confinement for, sometimes over a week. Sometimes they were assigned the harshest labor, and their sentences were extended again and again and again, and they would never get out of Dozier. The black boys were assigned the hardest, most dangerous tasks and punished more often and more violently than the white boys. Some boys came in with short sentences for petty offenses, but because staff labeled them incorrigible or simply wanted to keep them as free labor or keep them on the football team, they stayed months or years longer than they should have. I mean, with this, there were reports of boys being shot when trying to escape. There was one report of a boy being shoved in a dryer, which was then turned on, and he was killed. I mean, they couldn't run away because of the fear, and sometimes where would they go? I mean, many were hours from home, and sometimes their situations at home were nearly just as bad, so they had no place to run. This was the dark heart of Dozier, a place that promised redemption, but delivered only fear, exploitation, and forgotten, lost, or often, sometimes murdered children. Physical and psychological abuse ran rampant. Classes and learning, no, that hardly occurred. Some students sometimes earned trips into town or were able to play on sports teams on campus for good behavior, but even this was always constantly threatened with being taken away from them. It was just another tactic, a way to control them, not reward them. Some boys were forced to play on teams, beaten if they refused. And these beatings that I've been talking about, they included things like missing teeth, broken bones. They weren't merely spankings or whippings like I mentioned before. They were truly horrific, terrible beatings of adults hitting young children. What makes things at the Dozier School more heartbreaking is that it wasn't hidden away in the shadows. The horrors taking place on campus, they were known. Complaints poured in from parents, from townspeople, and even some staff who saw what was happening. But no one in power actually acted. There was time to stop the abuse, to prosecute the crimes. But the state, it looked the other way. And by the time the truth finally came out, the statute of limitations had run out, leaving the victims with shattered lives and just no justice, no recourse for what had happened to them. For decades, state officials and lawmakers, they visited the school themselves, touring the campuses, inspecting dormitories, and even hearing complaints from parents and community members. They knew about the whippings, the forced labor, the unmarked graves, or at least they knew enough that they should have asked questions. But every time it ended the same way, these visits, with reassurances from administrators that everything was under control, that this discipline, it was necessary, and that the boys, they were being reformed. Government officials walked the same halls where boys were beaten. Legislators stood in the White House, the very building used for torturous whippings. But instead of forcing change, they left with sanitized reports and empty promises given to them. Inspections found problems, but recommended reforms were rarely, if ever, enforced. Meanwhile, at this time, survivors and townspeople, they kept raising alarms about the abuse, only to be ignored or dismissed. This wasn't just a failure of one school, it was a failure of everyone in power who saw the signs and did absolutely nothing, who just didn't care. A reminder that when we look away from suffering, we become totally complicit in it. For more than a century, the Arthur G. Dozier School for Boys kept operating, despite horrifying stories of abuse, of disappearances, and of unmarked graves. So, what was finally, able to shut down this school? I mean, it had been in operation for 111 years at this point. But in the early 2000s, brave survivors known as the White House Boys came forward together, sharing what had happened to them as children, the beatings, the rapes, the boys who never made it home. They actually have a YouTube channel that you should look at if you're interested. I mean, it's so sad, but if you're interested, you should look it up. So eventually, their stories reached the news. And, it sparked outrage. So investigations by the Florida Department of Law Enforcement were able to uncover disturbing details. The U.S. Department of Justice found Florida's juvenile justice system was violating federal civil rights laws. Yeah, you think? At the same time, enrollment at Dozier was dropping fast. From hundreds of boys just, 10, 15 years before, to now there were fewer than 70. So by 2011, with less than 70 students, the state could no longer justify spending millions just to keep it running. It used to make money, and now it was costing money. Faced with scandals, bad publicity, federal scrutiny, and falling numbers, Florida officials finally decided to shut the doors of this fucking hellscape. In January 2011, Governor Rick Scott's administration announced that Dozier would close, citing budget concerns, but everybody that was local, knew the real reason was that the school's dark history had become impossible to hide any longer. The school's closure was so long overdue, but for so many boys, it came far, far too late. When Dozier finally closed in 2011, investigators discovered dozens of unmarked graves. Official records said that roughly 30 boys had died, but researchers later found nearly 60 sets of remains, many with signs of blunt force trauma or gunshots. Families who had been told their sons just simply ran away and were lost learned decades later that they'd actually died at Dozier and were buried in secret. For more than a century, the true number of boys who died at the Dozier School, it was hidden. It was buried under official records that claimed only 30 children had ever perished there. But in 2012, the University of South Florida stepped in to uncover the truth. The real truth. Led by forensic anthropologist Dr. Aaron Kimmerly, a team from USF used ground-penetrating radar excavation and DNA analysis to search the Boot Hill Cemetery, which was like a little unmarked cemetery on Dozier grounds. What they found shocked even longtime critics of the school. At least 55 unmarked graves, nearly double the number Florida had ever admitted. Some of the boys' remains showed, like I said, signs of blunt force trauma, gunshots. Many were buried anonymously. Some deaths had never been investigated. Most of them hadn't. Dr. Kimmerly and her team spent years trying to identify each child, returning some remains to families who had spent a lifetime searching for answers. And their work shattered decades of silence, proving once and for all that what happened at Dozier wasn't just a rumor. It was a tragedy hidden in plain sight. These allegations, they were true. So let me just state once again that for more than a century, there were complaints from parents desperate for answers, townspeople horrified by the screams, and even staff members who tried to speak out. But no one with any real power ever truly listened or acted. No one did anything. While the crimes were happening, there was time to prosecute to stop the abuse, but nothing happened. No charges were filed. Over the years, statutes of limitations, they ran out eventually, leaving victims and families without any path to justice. In the end, not one person was ever held criminally responsible for what happened at Dozier. Sometimes people were replaced, but nobody was ever had charges filed against them. This wasn't just the failure of one school, it was a failure of an entire system, a society that saw poor, troubled, or even neglected children as disposable, and a state that pretty much clearly valued profit over those children's lives. Parts of the campus still stand today, rotting reminders of the boys who never came home. Memorials now mark some of the graves, but many children's identities and their stories are still lost. It's been so long now. if you're interested, you can find many survivor stories that are just heartbreaking. Most of them have all had difficult lives since they got out of school. And I don't know, they've been trying to deal with the years of trauma and abuse since, and that's basically unimaginable. But yeah, I mean, if you want to scour the internet, you can find survivor stories. I know that there's been a book that was written by a Pulitzer Prize winning author called The Nickel Boys. They got a lot of publicity. I haven't actually read it, but I just got it, so I'm about to read it. I've heard that, well, heartbreaking, it's great. Like I said, the White House Boys, they have a YouTube channel that's pretty interesting if you want to look that up. At this point, so many survivors are, getting older, so their stories are harder and harder to find or to hear, but I don't know, they're worth listening to, I think. So thanks for sticking with me till the end of this one. I know it was probably difficult to learn about had you not previously known or heard about this place, but if the story affects you or resonates with you as it did with me, I mean, please share it. These children, these guys, they deserve to be remembered. What do you think? Do you think Florida should reopen investigations even now after so much time? I'm sure some of these jailers or teachers are still alive. Anyway, as always, please subscribe if you want more stories that were buried and should never have been forgotten. I'm Caroline. This is Hidden Headlines, and thanks for watching. Bye.